that the famous photograph of the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima, the Marines during World War II, which was first done, and I gather the picture itself was restaged for a better shot, but nonetheless,
icons are better when they're touched up a bit.
the idea that you know, these men in uniform, these men making the sacrifice, raised the national banner, was echoed and was seen immediately as an echo when the three firefighters raised the flag at the rubble of Ground Zero. So there are these things which seem to emerge, to our eyes of course, as fundamental, essential American responses to what has happened.
That is fundamentally American in its iconic visual character, but of course you would find similar imagery in statues and monument memorialization all over the world, especially in Europe, with its so many world wars, and actually 19th and 20th century wars, and variations on military monuments. But yeah, that image of Iwo Jima, who knows, is probably in the heads of half of Americans. And when they saw the firemen with the flag, they couldn't resist it. We also have to think here hard about just what kinds of nationalism and patriotism that 9/11 tapped in all of us, and how moving it was to see the world, for a while at least, calling themselves Americans and feeling their vulnerability with us. And since that, of course, some of them have had to be vulnerable. And we are in those moments pushed back upon a few set of values. Maybe it's the four first principles of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Maybe it's Lincoln's great peroration in the Gettysburg Address. Maybe it's even for some Woodrow Wilson's idea of self-determination. Maybe it's just our Bill of Rights. But there was that moment. It lasted. It still lasts, that we were attacked because of our values, by our own machines, so to speak. And there's a way in which there's nothing more vulnerable than that, to be attacked at such a symbolic site of American commerce by airplanes, and then of course the U.S. Capitol also attacked. We were attacked for essentially what we are, it seemed. I mean, now of course the story is much more complex in causes and consequences. But it forced us to suddenly think, so what do we share? And I'll say this, I mean, I as a historian and a teacher in particular, am deeply interested in these moments that actually do make us think collectively. There's, you know, in the academy, as you know, in the last generation and more, in cultural studies or whatever field you want to name, there's been a lot of discussion about whether there's anything anymore that's truly universal, whether there's any kind of real truth, whether there's any sort of objectivity, and so on. But I think 9/11 did force us to think about universals. It's a shame, it's a tragedy, of course, genuine tragedy, that sometimes it takes great violence and vulnerability before we actually understand our universals. But for Americans to think about universals, of course, we always do it through our own documents and institutions because we believe we are a universal. We believe that. I mean, that's essential. It gets us into great trouble at times in our history, and it also is probably one secret to some of our triumphs and why the world still tries now and then to model us. Because we try to be anyway, a nation of laws and a nation of liberties. Without the Bill of Rights, there is no United States.
So American exceptionalism is a kind of universalism at the same time.
American exceptionalism is that thing we love to hate and love to love. It depends on when we want to use it. And it depends sometimes on what political side you are of a particular policy or issue. Our history, to some degree, we're generalizing here, is exceptional. If you think about all of modern history, a republic that survives this long is pretty unusual. Our Constitution's pretty unusual. It's also, of course, been extraordinarily flawed and destructive of the rights of some Americans, large numbers of Americans. And I think here again, The reason we're talking about the Civil War so much, or the reason you're talking to me here, in relation to 9/11 is because we are trying to understand ahead what 9/11 will actually mean. We're guessing hard at that. And arguably the Civil War is not only the central event of American history, but it's a pivot. It's a huge pivot. It's actually the destruction of that first republic, born of the Revolution. It really died in the Civil. That's exactly what Lincoln argued in the Gettysburg Address. He's saying to his audience, First Republic is dead. You have to create a new one. Because the Civil War forced the creation of a second republic rooted in the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendments to the Constitution, the Reconstruction Act, the First Civil Rights Act. And because that second republic didn't work very well and it was overwhelmed by racism and Jim Crow, we in effect created a third republic in the Civil Rights Revolution. We're living, arguably, I mean, if the French are living in whatever it is, the Fifth Republic now, we're living in our third. And so when something like this happens, that's so big, fundamental, and forces us back on ourselves and our values, we try to think of those pivots in our own history when the same thing happened.